Sustainability means that you won't do anything that's going to create a burden on the next generation or the 7 generations to come. It's simple. So, does that mean you don't do a pipeline, or you don't do a high voltage line, or any infrastructure, or anything? This is the world we live in, and sometimes we have to make some balanced decisions. But we should make them educated and try to have the lowest burden as possible. That's all sustainability is. So, sustainability is what brings me to what I do. And you look at this company that we formed in 2007 called KS Energy. And what does it stand for? It stands for the area that we work in Africa, which is called Karoo Basin. And S stands for sustainability. Karoo Sustainable Energy is the name of our company. And that's how I think about everything I do when I go through business decisions in our company. I'm not going to go through a lot of this information, but I will leave it for anybody that wants to get it with the American Indian Student Services. But basically, this was a company that we set up to do projects in Africa, exclusively in Africa, that was going to be taking everything that I had experienced and compact that down into working only on projects that I like. Being my own company, I got to choose on who I work with and where I work and how I work. I don't have to answer to the, any, let's say hierarchy that has us on a mission to do things which I don't believe in, which I did a lot in my career as I was young. This is a picture of a power station which we built in the middle of the Kalahari Desert in south central sub-Saharan Africa. I'll show you a few more pictures of that coming up. But what our company does, basically, as I mentioned, the gas turbines is the core of our business. And that's where we started. That's where we really did thrive early in our business. So we do very deep technical work, from designing power stations, building them, getting them developed, getting people to accept them, and then operating and maintaining them after they're built. A lot of that comes along with the development of projects, taking an idea, going to a village and sitting down with the chief of the tribe of that area, and I've done that many, many times in Africa, to find out what is it you need. And do you want us, first of all? If you do, then let's work together to try to find solutions to what your needs are. And there is several slides now on a new business model that we're pursuing in Africa that I'm going to show you. But as I go through this journey, I've developed this reputation of working on these kind of new and innovative businesses, and I often get asked to speak at different conferences, and I get interviews on TV and different things like that.
Arvinder Gantura works for a company that installs solar-powered solutions in homes in Kenya. He says he's seeing a consistent rise in demand from new home buyers and builders.
Now everyone is making sure that they install a solar system during the time of building. So this has worked to the advantage of solar contractors in Kenya, and which in turn means more business for us.
One such project is this new housing scheme in Nairobi, and residents say tapping the sun's energy means cheaper electricity and hot water.
So we're able to have hot water throughout the day, depending on the usage, and also in the night. Yeah, so we don't have to to put power on. You always have hot water whichever time you need during the day.
The entire continent's power generation capacity is 147 gigawatts. That's roughly how much electricity Belgium produces in a year. This isn't nearly enough to meet Africa's energy needs, and almost half of its population don't have access to electricity. Renewable resources can fill this gap, but only if at least $32 billion are invested in the industry every year until 2030. The use of renewable resources of energy is rising around the world, but nowhere is this growth faster than in parts of sub-Saharan Africa where grids don't reach. Villagers in Cameroon are using solar cells to power filters to produce clean drinking water. Farmers in far-flung areas of Senegal are powering their communities in eco-friendly ways. And in Tunisia, the same technology is being used to power the communications infrastructure. Experts say African countries hold immense potential for solar energy because of their geographical location.
Solar energy is viable in Kenya. Kenya, lying on the equator, has some of the best solar installation in the globe. I think it's about 4.5 kilowatts per hour, so which is actually very good. And if the solar energy is well harnessed, it could actually help in stability of our grid.
Studies by developmental agencies like the World Bank show a strong link between access to electricity and higher GDP growth. And for many of the continent's struggling economies, tapping the abundant natural resources like wind, water, and solar energy can lead to a brighter future. Mubin Nasser, TRT World.
Now, KS Energy is a power generation company based in Botswana and Nigeria, and it manages projects around Africa, including Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, and Nigeria, among others. Its CEO, Steve Martin, joins us now for this subject. Steve, great to have you on the show. From your perspective, what does Africa's power sector need right now? Is it more investment? Is it more political will? What is it?
It needs more exploitation of the natural resources that Africa has. Fuel is a major issue in Africa, and the evolution of the renewables in Africa has been a very strong impetus for growth, at least allowing Africa to keep up with its population growth. The larger mega infrastructure projects of years past with imported fuels was such a heavy burden, requiring treasury guarantees and all sorts of other enhancements to make projects happen, that they just got stalled. Now the projects are downsizing, they're getting smaller, they're trying to use more indigenous fuels, and more government and public sector, private sector cooperation, public-private partnerships that are making projects happen. In effect, the African countries have just pushed back on this heavy burden and said, let's develop projects that we need. They don't have to be mega projects.
The other thing, of course, that's changed over the years is the technology has changed.
Incredible.
And renewable energy prices have come down immeasurably. How have those factors helped you in your business in Africa?
Well, it's created an entire new sector that's going after the off-grid consumers. And I don't mean individual households only, but mining sector, tourism. Those places that have been spending close to 30 cents, US cents per kilowatt hour for electricity, because of technology evolution, are able to acquire electricity at probably 10 cents per kilowatt hour. So imagine what that does to the cost of mining or the cost of tourism in relation to their overall profit. It's going to make Africa more competitive. I liken it to what happened maybe 10 years ago in Latin America and Africa with the landline versus the mobile telephone. We've seen that kind of a leap of technology in the last 3 years with renewables.
So African countries are effectively leapfrogging some of the intermediate steps and going straight to these kind of distributed energy solutions.
Absolutely. And I think that's going to be a trend going forward. And anybody that's not prepared to react to that trend isn't going to be in business. The days of pulling wires and poles for high voltage billion-dollar infrastructure investments, I think, are past.
There is a big difference, though, between Northern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa in this trend. I mean, in Northern Africa, a lot of countries are actually now kind of exporting energy to Europe because of all the renewable investment that they've had over there. But it's a very different story in Sub-Saharan Africa. How is Sub-Saharan Africa going to catch up?
Sub-Saharan Africa is really in a completely different league, if you will, in terms of where it's at today and where it's trying to get to in the short term and in the medium term. The figure is 600 million people without quality access to electricity in Sub-Saharan Africa. That number is growing. It's not getting less. Although there's more electricity available, the population and when you look at the added capacity of generation, they're not going in a crisscross way. They're still going apart. So it's going to take a lot more of these kind of investments having success in the local communities and people embracing them, and investors and companies like ourselves that are going to have to embrace this size of a playground versus the billion-dollar projects that we were maybe used to 5 years ago.
Right. Would love to catch up with you again in the future and see where you're going. But for now, Steve Martin, KS Energy, thank you very much for coming in to talk to us.
What you saw there, I think, is the future of where energy is going. And the U.S. isn't aware of it yet, but the rest of the world is. And you see a lot of discussion still in the U.S. news about things like saving the coal industry. That ship has sailed, people. Coal is never going to come back, thank God. I worked for a company that did coal, and I was forced to work on some of those things when I was young. But I promise you, coal is never going to recover. And all those other projects that involve unfriendly to the environment fuels are also gone. They don't know it yet, but most of them are gone. Things outside of the US are dictating how investments and technologies are evolving. You've read recently about the tariffs on Chinese solar because they were accused of price dumping. That's not true. The world demanded that solar come down in price, so the Chinese developed technology to manufacture better quality product at a lower price. I know that because there are a lot of other countries that have followed them now and are doing that manufacturing. I'll give you an example. The price of solar, to do 1 megawatt of solar, used to cost around $2.5 million to $3 million for a 1 megawatt solar project. Today, in 3 years' time, that has gone down to about $900,000. So it's less than $1 million. It's about 30–40% of what the old cost was 3 to 5 years ago. And there's a lot of technologies evolving because of demand, and that's going to continue to happen. This is the power station that we built. It's based on natural gas fuel in Botswana, and it's in the middle of the Kalahari Desert. I'm still a very strong believer that natural gas fuel is also a good fuel for the future. If you have to have another sort of fuel which is not renewable, I think it's one of the best. It's one of the best because if there are spills of this in one form or another, it's methane gas, and it's not great for the environment. It has its downsides as well, but it's certainly better than what happens with coal or what happens with oil or other types of fuel. And I'm going to talk to you now in a little bit about how that comes together with renewables and what we're doing. This is another natural gas-fired power plant in Port Harcourt, and this has got 30 megawatt turbines, 3 of them, gas turbines, and they're all on wheels, if you see right here. So this was site conditions, about 80 megawatts of power that we installed in 15 days. All on wheels, we just put it in there, and that plant was providing electricity to an area called the Niger Delta, which is a very dangerous part of the world. And we built that plant from the beginning when we started engineering till we were completely done in about 5 months' time, but very short time in construction on the ground. This is another plant in Nigeria that we did that's based on Siemens gas turbines, and there's again 3 gas turbines. And it also runs on natural gas. It started on another fuel that was heavy fuel oil, bunker fuel, for about a year while they completed the gas delivery to this plant. So you see I have a lot of references and experience on gas turbines and gas, so I do have a belief in it. And I'm not the only one that really has this vision. This is another little bit of a story I want to tell you. When we first did that power plant in Botswana, it was an area where there was a lot of AIDS epidemic and a lot of bad things going on. And the chiefs from that local community, we went to them and asked them if there's something we could do for their community since they've given us this opportunity to work with them. And they wanted us to build an orphanage, and we did that. This is another plant in Nigeria. Now, a lot of companies do those things, but I want to tell you that that was the first money we ever made in Africa. And that comes also from my teachings and my philosophy of giving back to the people who are working with you. It was very important that we take our first money and do something with it. This was a school that we were asked to do later in Nigeria. We took the school over, and this is what it looked like on the left. It was shut down and the kids were outside learning. They weren't able to learn in a classroom, and so we redid the whole school. And believe me, it wasn't a lot of money. It was probably like $30,000 to do a school for 70 students. But you can't believe what it meant to that local community and to the kids themselves. We were there for the opening. They had a nice dance ceremony, and they had their own version of jingle dancers and the whole bit that was just fantastic. It was really a nice experience.
Thank you for in our school.
So back to Africa. What we know is that PV solar investments are happening faster than any other power generation outside of the US, by far. Everybody's focused on solar because you can actually generate electricity made from solar and sell it at acceptable profit for about 6 US cents per kilowatt hour. If you were looking at coal projects, it's about 8 cents per kilowatt hour, not considering any environmental liability. If you look at natural gas, it's about 10 cents per kilowatt hour. If you look at wind, it's maybe 12. So it keeps going up like that. But solar is by far the cheapest fuel right now, the cheapest generation form. The problem with solar is it's only sunny for maybe 5.5 to 6 peak hours per day. So you got to find something to go along with solar, because the thing that I talked about in that video about people going from the landline to the smartphone, it's amazing, but there are generations of people your age that have never held a landline in many parts of the world. Never, ever. And they all have iPhones. Maybe 2. The same thing is happening with electricity and energy. There are going to be generations of people who never buy their electricity from highline wires that connect their homes. They're going to generate it at the source, or in their local village, or their community, or factories. That one power plant I showed you in Nigeria that we did is completely off the grid. We supply to 2 villages, we supply to a cement industry, we supply to, I think, a glass manufacturing plant, and they don't have any source of electricity from anybody other than us. But it's still expensive power because that's purely on natural gas. So solar is by far the biggest power generation source. But if you look at the predictions that are happening, hydro is going to go down. As I said, the coal ship has sailed. Hydro is no longer going to be a fuel of the future in a growth sense, because the predictability of who has water and when is not as reliable as it was, and people are realizing that the use of water for power generation is really not that good from an ecological point of view. It does a lot of harm to the environment, maybe more harm than it does good, although there are some good things it does. It doesn't produce carbon dioxide and things like that. So most people feel that the future of energy comes from renewables and gas. Why gas? Gas, as I mentioned, has a lot of environmental benefit, but it also has a future that is growing from that side because of where people want to take, if they use fossil fuels, that's the one fuel that a lot of people feel more comfortable with. So people in North Dakota are producing gas today, but they don't have a pipeline to put it in. How are they producing it? It's associated with the oil that they're producing from all of that shale. So a byproduct that comes along with it is gas. And there was a law that was passed a few years ago that said you can't just take that natural gas and vent it or flare it or throw it away. You have to do something with it. If you're going to take it out, do something. And now there's an attempt to try to change those laws to allow them to just vent it because it's a burden. It's a burden. It's a product. And there is ways and technology have evolved, like the solar, that have allowed people to take that natural gas and liquefy it, put it in trucks and use it as a fuel. And I'm going to show you one such project like that and a project that we're doing right now in Africa. If I can make this computer cooperate. These are some things that I worked on, but in essence what you do, you just take the gas and you put it in these trucks like this and then truck it around rather than put it in pipelines. I'm not an advocate of pipelines. I don't think that it's necessarily required in every instance, especially when you don't have a huge market on the other end. But you can easily move natural gas like this in places, and this is a typical power plant. You'd move it in a truck like that, put it in tanks like this, and then basically just heat it up a little bit with these little radiators, and it becomes gas again. So what we're planning on doing is putting PV solar in, using the solar energy for about maybe 5 or 6 hours per day, and then we're going to back that solar energy up when the sun isn't shining with power generated from natural gas. And so that's how I'm developing our business. And that's our business model, is to build like lots of these small plants where electricity is required, and not put up high voltage lines to move electricity or pipelines to move the fuel, but to do it all right where people need the electricity. And our project in Africa involves taking some gas in a country called Tanzania, right here on the coast, and then making that gas into a liquid and trucking it all across Tanzania and across this country called Zambia and into Botswana, and stopping all along the way with those trucks and creating opportunities for communities to have power, industries to grow. And it's together with, again, this hybrid, we call it, hybrid solar plus LNG. So liquefying it, transporting it, and then using it again by taking it from a liquid and making it a gas again, just by heating it up a little bit. Now back to this story in North Dakota about gas, whether they take that gas, they're already producing it, venting it, or making a usable product. I found this project of a plant that was built in, I think it was in Tioga, North Dakota. It's called North Dakota LNG. And it's what we call in the world now small-scale LNG. And it's one of probably, I want to say, 30 or 40 commercial plants that are running. But this is the whole thing, and it's in a building in North Dakota because it's cold out there. And it's actually running. And it's taking that gas because there's no pipeline, and it's making it into LNG so it can be consumed. And it's not very big. This is a computer model of the one we're talking about building, which is the same size in Tanzania. You see that one truck out there? That's a typical kind of big tanker that moves fuel. So it's not a very big footprint, and that supplies all the fuel that we need for a 100 megawatt size power plant. And it does it economically viable and cheaper than it costs to inject those gas molecules into a pipeline and then move it a few hundred kilometers. So it's actually cheaper to do it that way today because of technology evolution that's happened than it is to build pipelines. So why not do it that way? I mean, why not? There's nothing that says you have to follow that old paradigm of building infrastructure that nobody really needs if you can do it in a better way at a lower price. Why is it better? Because if that demand goes away in the future, you don't have the pipeline to worry about. You don't have the burden of government guarantees to finance it. You don't have the burden of all the landowners to go across their land. You don't have so many burdens, and it still does it for a lower price. So the answer is because you take control away from a lot of people when you do things like this. People who have a vested interest in seeing pipelines built or infrastructure. And from my experience, at least in the developing world, that usually is also surrounded by corruption. People like those big construction projects because it puts money in people's pockets. That's a fact, and I've witnessed it in so many countries. So that's our project, is basically to take solar, LNG, and link them together and create solutions for communities as small as a school or a hospital, a university, provide power where it's needed. And I'll show you a couple of examples of these plants that we have with our partners. This is one for a hotel in the southern part of Turkey, has one tank and one radiator, and it supplies all the cooling, all the heating, all the electricity for this resort. This is one for a factory that makes tea. So basically drying tea leaves and packaging them. And you can see it's a little bit bigger installation, but the same principle. So these trucks come up here once a week or once a day or whatever. For a typical power plant, the one that I showed you in Botswana, which is a major power plant, 100 megawatts, it would take about 8 big trucks a day, which is kind of the equivalent of what you would say like a Super America filling station, those big trucks that come and bring diesel. So it's not a big burden on the roads or things like that. But we also work very close with the communities and with the highway department to make sure that we're within safety, of course, restrictions. This is another facility. I think it's just an industrial facility, but you get the point. This is an office building. Now, imagine this office building with roof tiles on top for solar and this LNG on the side, and it doesn't have any connection to a grid. In fact, it has its own internet satellite connection, so there's no wires and no infrastructure connecting that type of a professional facility for all of its own needs at a cost that's probably even better than if they were connected to those major infrastructures. Those technologies exist today, and that's where the world is going. The US is probably pushing back against that in many regards in policy and everything else, but the rest of the world doesn't really care. It's already made that move. So it would behoove all of you young future leaders to think about that as you become our leaders in planning and doing all of these things. You should keep an eye on what the rest of the world is doing, because most people think that America still leads the world in many things. I'm sorry to tell you, but that's not the truth anymore. And we are behind in many regards. And so it would be good for you to realize that and not be ashamed or afraid of it. Just to embrace it and say, yeah, okay, well, what can I learn from what people are doing in places like Africa or China or India without feeling threatened? Because there is a lot more advanced evolution of technologies and the way people consume things around the world. That's a fact. I've lived it firsthand for a lot of years. That's my presentation to you today. So thank you all.